April, the year 997, the Prussian coast of the Baltic Sea. 7 pagan priests tighten their grip on their spears. Before them on the ground stands a man in a torn monastic habit. A short, guttural order rings out, and the iron points pierce straight through his body. One of the pagans draws an axe, severs the dead man's head, and mounts it on a wooden stake, turning the face toward the west. It might seem like the typical death of an unlucky missionary in the early Middle Ages, just another preacher who wandered a little too deep into a foreign forest. The priests are absolutely certain that they have simply protected their gods from a hostile outsider. What they don't yet understand is that they have just executed the largest geopolitical transaction of the decade. Without even realizing it, they have handed the perfect gift to a ruler located hundreds of kilometers away. A gift that will allow him to completely redraw the map of Europe. This ruler's name is Boleslav. Later, historians will bestow upon him the moniker the Brave. But for now, he is a young, calculating, and ruthless Slavic warlord. He knows perfectly well it is not enough to simply seize the throne by slaughtering your rivals. It is not enough to assemble the most effective cavalry force east of the Elbe River. A state cannot be held together for long by steel alone. In order for arrogant Europe to recognize you as an equal, in order for empires to actually reckon with you, you need a myth. You need the ultimate divine sanction. Boleslav understands something that many of his neighbors fail to see. In the 10th century, a dead bishop is vastly more useful than a living one. This is the second episode of the series The Piasts, the Iron Age. Over the next hour, we will dissect the anatomy of medieval legitimacy and show you exactly how sovereignty is built when you have absolutely nothing at your disposal but an army and cold, hard calculation. We will look at how political rivals had their eyes burned out in order to eliminate them without turning them into martyrs. We will break down the war economy of the Piast dynasty, how they maintained a massive regular army that never once plowed a field. You will find out why, in those times, the bones of saints were worth more than gold, how the medieval canonization factory operated, and how the ruler of a peripheral state managed to hack the political code of Europe, forcing the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire to walk to him barefoot through the snow. But to truly understand how Boleslav managed to pull off this grand combination, we need to take a look at the world around him. The year 1000 is rapidly approaching. Europe is living in a thick, nervous anticipation of the end of the world. Peasants, barons, and bishops alike, everyone is waiting for the sky to come crashing down to the earth at any moment. In this highly volatile time, the Holy Roman Empire is being ruled by a young boy. Otto III is only 17 years old. He is a profound idealist. Half Saxon, half Byzantine, he dreams of something unprecedented to renew the Roman Empire by uniting the entire Christian world into one universal family. In his grand vision, there is no place for bloody wars. The world must be bound together by the guiding light of faith. And right on the eastern borders of his empire lies Poland. For the German elite, this is nothing more than a barbaric periphery, wild, untamed lands that are expected to pay their tribute on time and submit unquestioningly to the authority of Germanic archbishops. Boleslav is categorically unsatisfied with this arrangement. He needs to force the young emperor to speak to him as an absolute equal. But how do you accomplish that if, to the Roman bureaucracy, you are an absolute nobody? It all begins with a single document, a document that Boleslav decides to destroy. To understand the man who single-handedly seized power in Poland in the year 992, we need to rewind the clock back 20 years. The year is 973. The imperial diet in Quedlinburg. The entire elite of Europe converges there. And to that very place, they bring a 6-year-old boy from the Slavic forests. This is Boleslav. His father, Mieszko I, having lost his latest political chess match, is forced to hand over his eldest son as an honorable hostage to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, Otto I. The taking of underage heirs as hostages was a standard guarantee of peace in those days. But for young Boleslav, this captivity becomes his ultimate school of life. Back home in Gniezno and Poznan, he had seen wooden fortresses and tribal customs. Here, he sees massive stone cathedrals, a complex administrative chancery, Latin books, and a colossal army clad entirely in iron. He eats dinner at the exact same table with the men who are carving up the map of Europe. The boy absorbs the fundamental rule of this world. The empire only understands force. If you are weak, they will swallow you whole. If you are strong, they will sign a treaty with you. A few years later, he returns home, but he returns as a stranger. By that time, his mother, the Bohemian princess Dobrawa, has passed away. Mieszko I marries for a second time. His chosen bride is Oda, a noble German nun whom the prince literally abducted from a monastery. Oda gives birth to her own sons. Boleslav watches as his stepmother methodically squeezes him out of the line of succession. She lobbies for the interests of her own children, leaning heavily on powerful connections back in Germany. To avoid an open conflict, Mieszko sends his eldest son far away from the capital down south, to rule over Krakow and Lesser Poland. These are lands the Piasts had only recently conquered from the Bohemians. Down there, Boleslav doesn't waste his time nursing grievances. He forms his own court, gathers fiercely loyal men, and secures political marriages. And he waits. He understands perfectly well. When his father dies, his stepmother will never willingly hand over the power to him. In the year 992, Mieszko I dies. He leaves behind a very strange document known to historians as the Dagome Judex. It is a piece of parchment sent directly to Rome. Essentially, it is the first written legal act of the Polish state. In it, Mieszko places his entire realm under the personal protection of the Pope. But if you read the text closely, his true motive becomes glaringly obvious. The document lists the rulers of the country. It explicitly mentions Oda and her 2 sons. Bolesław's name is completely erased from the record. His father had officially stripped him of his rights to the core lands. In Mieszko's grand design, Rome was supposed to serve as the guarantor of this partition. Papal authority and German connections were meant to shield Oda from the ambitions of her fully grown stepson. But Boleslav didn't bother writing appeals to the Vatican. He had learned the lessons of Quedlinburg far too well. Parchments and wax seals only ever work when there are drawn swords standing right behind them. They had barely buried his father's body before the 25-year-old Boleslav struck. No compromises, no pleading letters to the Pope. He mobilizes his Krakow regiments, initiates a lightning-fast march to the north, seizes control of the key fortresses, and simply throws Oda, along with his underage half-brothers, completely out of the country. They flee in a panic to Germany. The family is exiled.
But a major problem remains inside the country. Oda had influential supporters among the Polish nobility. Local barons who had hoped to become regents for the young princes and run the state in their name.
The chronicles have preserved the names of the two leaders of this opposition, Odilin and Przybywój. They outright refused to recognize the usurper. An armed rebellion is brewing. Usually in such cases, tribal warlords would simply slaughter their competitors. But Boleslav thinks differently. He knows, if you spill the blood of these men, their vast extended clans will be obligated to respond. A bloody vendetta will ignite, a long, drawn-out civil war that will devour the young state from the inside out faster than any invading German margraves ever could. So Boleslav employs a tactic that the West would have deemed pure barbarism, but which Byzantium considered to be a highly refined political art. Odilin and Przybywój were captured. They didn't have their heads chopped off. Instead, they had their eyes burned out. In the early Middle Ages, blinding is a cold, strictly functional technology. A blind man cannot mount a war horse. He cannot raise a sword. He is physically incapable of leading a war band and claiming rights to the throne. He is instantly transformed into a living political corpse. But because he is still breathing, no formal murder has taken place. Relatives are not honor-bound to exact revenge for spilled blood, and the mutilated man himself doesn't become a holy martyr in the eyes of the mob. It is the surgical, precise removal of a threat. The opposition froze in absolute terror. No one dared to utter Oda's name ever again. Boleslav seized the entirety of his father's power for himself and united the country by sheer force. However, this lightning-fast coup came with a very heavy price. The news quickly reached the Holy Roman Empire. Over there, they saw the picture with crystal clarity. An ambitious Slavic warlord had trampled upon his father's final will, insulted Rome, thrown a noble German widow out onto the street, and taken the throne by brute force. Boleslav found himself in total isolation. His neighbors looked at him as a highly dangerous usurper and were simply waiting for a convenient excuse to launch an invasion. He needed to prove his right to stand upon this land. And to start, he needed a tool, not delicate diplomatic arguments, but a real, heavy mechanism that would force any invading army to think twice before crossing the Polish border. Having blinded the leaders of the opposition and exiled his family from the country, Boleslav was left entirely alone at the summit of power. But fear is a highly unreliable foundation. Poland is tightly squeezed between major players. The Holy Roman Empire applying pressure from the west, Kievan Rus gathering strength in the east, and an aggressive Bohemia to the south. In such a hostile encirclement, the young state will not survive if it relies purely on a tribal militia. Peasants might pick up their spears, but they will scatter back to their homes the second it's time to sow the wheat. Boleslav desperately needed an uninterrupted, continuous mechanism for retaining power, and he built one. The chronicler Gallus Anonymous, writing a century later, left us a highly detailed calculation of this military machine. 3,900 heavy armor-clad horsemen and 13,000 shield-bearers, light infantry. For Eastern Europe at the turn of the 10th and 11th centuries, these numbers are absolutely staggering. These aren't just roaming bands of loyal men. This is a regular professional standing army that lives for nothing but war. But maintaining an army of that size immediately spawns a massive logistical problem. The country does not yet possess a complex taxation system. It has no silver or gold mines of its own. How on earth do you feed 17,000 soldiers? Boleslav solves this problem radically. He puts his entire retinue on full room and board. His warriors do not plow the earth, and they do not trade in the markets. The prince settles them in his own cities, feeds them entirely at his own expense, clothes them, and supplies them with first-rate weaponry and war horses. Gallus Anonymous mentions an absolutely astonishing detail of their daily lives. Boleslav personally paid the bride price for his warriors' wives. If a knight wanted to get married, the prince would hand the girl's family silver straight out of his own royal treasury. The army effectively became his own personal, enormous family, a family that depended on him completely, both physically and financially. Where exactly did the money come from to fund such a massive upkeep? A portion of the income was generated by the Baltic monopoly on amber, but the ultimate currency of the early Middle Ages was human beings, slaves. The Piast war machine operated as a strictly self-sustaining enterprise. The army would go on a raid against neighboring pagan tribes, crush localized rebellions, and take captives. These captives were then shackled in irons and driven to the largest slave markets in Europe, in Prague and Kiev. There, Slavic captives were bought up in bulk by merchants from Byzantium and the Arab Caliphate. In exchange, Boleslav received actual tons of Arab silver dirhams, which he then used to buy Frankish swords, chainmail, and the undying loyalty of his men. A closed, unimaginably brutal, but flawlessly functioning economic cycle. The heavy cavalry effortlessly shattered any resistance. The neighbors dutifully paid their tribute. Boleslav built a state that could ruthlessly defend its borders and impose its will on anyone nearby. But steel has its absolute limits. Swords are excellent for plundering, but they do not grant you legitimacy. You can sell 10,000 slaves and dress your cavalry head to toe in silk, but to the Pope in Rome and the Germanic elite, you will still just be a savage, an upstart who seized his father's lands by brute force. To enter the elite, exclusive club of European monarchs, an army simply wasn't enough for Boleslav. He needed a spiritual shield. And very soon, the exact man capable of granting him this elevated status came knocking on the gates of his fortress, all on his own. In the spring of 996, a man utterly exhausted from the road approached the wooden gates of Gniezno. Outwardly, he didn't stand out in the slightest. A simple monastic robe, worn-out shoes, the dust of spring roads caked on his face. The guards could have easily mistaken him for just another ordinary wandering monk. Hundreds of them were drifting across Europe from monastery to monastery in those days. But Boleslav ordered the gates thrown open and received this man with honors befitting a reigning monarch, because standing before him was Wojciech. In Latin-speaking Europe, he was known by the name Adalbert, and he was anything but a common vagabond. To truly grasp exactly who had just fallen into the hands of the Polish prince, you have to look at this guest's biography. Wojciech was an aristocrat to the very marrow of his bones, hailing from the immensely powerful Bohemian Slavnik dynasty. He had received a brilliant education in Magdeburg, read the ancient philosophers, and knew Latin flawlessly. By the age of 30, he had become the Bishop of Prague. Furthermore, Wojciech was a close personal friend of that very same young Holy Roman Emperor, Otto III. They had spent hours walking together through the monastery gardens in Rome, fiercely debating theology, church reform, and the ultimate future of the Christian world. Wojciech's access to the absolute highest chambers of European politics was completely unhindered. But he didn't come to Gniezno as an ambassador. He came as a fugitive. The bishopric in Prague had turned into an absolute catastrophe for him. Wojciech was an uncompromising idealist. He tried to force the Bohemian nobility to actually live according to the gospel. But the nobility wanted to live the old way, to practice polygamy, to drink heavily, and most importantly, to sell their own Christian captives into slavery to Muslim merchants. Wojciech protested vehemently, excommunicated the barons from the church, but ultimately he lost. Unable to endure it any longer, he abandoned his cathedral and left for Rome, settling in a monastery on the Aventine Hill. There, while performing the dirtiest, most menial chores, washing dishes and hauling water, he was absolutely, completely happy. The cold spring sea. Boleslav's 30 heavily armed warriors drop Wojciech and his 2 traveling companions, his half-brother Radim and the monk Benedict, off onto the sandy shore. Exactly as ordered, the guards turn the boat around and head straight back toward Gdansk. The 3 men in monastic robes are left entirely alone on the absolute edge of the world known to Europeans. These are the lands of the Prussians. Forget about the highly militarized Germanic state that will emerge under this name centuries later. At the end of the 10th century, this is a wild, utterly closed-off Baltic region, blanketed by dense forests and treacherous swamps. The Prussians of that era are a harsh but deeply pragmatic people. They grow incredibly wealthy on the amber trade, which is highly prized all the way down to the Mediterranean and the Arab East. They have no single unified king. Tribal life is strictly regulated by harsh, unwritten laws, the rulings of village elders and the pagan priests. And the absolute beating heart of this life is the sacred groves. The Baltic pagans did not build grand stone temples. Their altars were ancient, towering oak trees, massive stones, and natural springs. It was strictly, unequivocally forbidden for outsiders to enter these groves. You could not chop branches there, you could not hunt, and you couldn't even speak loudly, lest you provoke the terrible wrath of the nature spirits. Wojciech does not enter this fragile world like a careful, cautious diplomat. He bulldozes straight through. He does not know their language. He makes absolutely zero attempt to negotiate with the elders or find any sort of compromise. The bishop simply begins preaching and praying in places where his mere physical presence is already a profound sacrilege. To the Prussians, this man in bizarre clothing looked exactly the same way a vandal smashing a cathedral altar with a sledgehammer would look to us today. But here is the truly astonishing detail. The Prussians do not kill him right away. Initially, their reaction is marked much more by extreme irritation than by blind, murderous fury. They see a completely deranged foreigner
who is openly breaking their ancient laws. The chronicles have actually preserved an episode from one of their very first encounters. Wojciech was attempting to read a psalm when a local resident walked right up to him and struck him across the back with an oar with a vicious backhand swing. The blow was so incredibly forceful that the psalter flew entirely out of the bishop's hands. But this was not an assassination attempt. This was a crude, entirely unambiguous warning. He was explicitly told, "Leave. Go back exactly where you came from, or you are going to lose your head." Any normal, rational missionary would have stopped right there. They would have retreated to safe territory, attempted to hire local translators, or tried to bribe the tribal chieftains. But we remember exactly who Wojciech was. This is a man whose entire family had been slaughtered down to the last child. An intellectual utterly crushed by profound guilt and profound disillusionment with his own past. It truly seems that he did not come to these shores to baptize thousands of pagans. He wasn't searching for a flock at all. He was actively searching for martyrdom. Wojciech entirely ignores the brutal warning. He stays. The bishop and his two companions continue walking straight through Prussian lands, moving from one settlement to the next, ostentatiously and deliberately violating sacred taboos. They set up their camps right next to the holy trees. They flatly refuse to submit to the laws of the tribe. For the Prussian elders, this rapidly ceases to be a minor, annoying incident.
The outsider is no longer merely irritating. He is actively insulting the gods. If the spirits are angered, the tribe will be left without a harvest, or they will lose their very next war. Leaving this man alive becomes an active, existential threat to the survival of the entire clan. The patience of the pagans completely runs out. The date is April 23rd, 997. Wojciech, Radim, and Benedict are sleeping peacefully in a forest clearing. They do not yet know that an armed detachment of Prussian priests and warriors has already picked up their trail. The final decision has been made. Let us return to April 23rd, 997, to that exact moment on the Baltic shore where our entire story began. 7 Prussian spears drive right through Wojciech's body. His head is hacked off and mounted on a stake. The pagan priests execute the bishop in cold blood, yet they deliberately leave his 2 companions, Radim and Benedict, alive. And this is not some sudden flash of unexpected mercy. This is pure, pragmatic business calculation. The Prussians know perfectly well that the murdered man came directly from the lands of their highly influential southern neighbor, and dead men cannot negotiate. The pagans need a courier who will return to Gniezno and name their final price to Boleslav. When Radim finally reaches the Polish capital and delivers the news of the former Bishop of Prague's gruesome death, Boleslav does not fly into a blind rage. He has absolutely no time for emotions. He has just been handed the most perfect window of opportunity. The Prussians are offering to ransom the remains, and the prince agrees immediately. This is exactly where a beautiful, grand church myth is born. Later on, the chroniclers would invent a legendary tale about the scales. Supposedly, Boleslav promised to pay the exact weight of his dead friend's body in solid gold. The decapitated corpse was placed on one side of the scale and the precious jewels on the other. And then a divine miracle occurred. The martyr's bones suddenly became entirely weightless. It required barely any gold at all. The reality turned out to be much heavier, literally. There were no divine miracles involving scales. It was a dry, utterly cynical, diplomatic haggling session with the very men who had just butchered your guest. Boleslav paid a truly massive ransom in full-weight silver, most likely the exact same Arab dirhams he had earned from selling captive slaves. The logistics of this transaction were incredibly grim. The summer of 997. Heading south, cutting through dense forests, navigating ruined dirt roads, a wooden wagon slowly transports a decomposing body. The head traveled completely separately. In the medieval economy of holy relics, a shrine is essentially a modular construction. A completely separate negotiation had to be conducted for Wojciech's severed head, and according to some accounts, a different envoy actually ransomed it at a later date. To the people of that era, there was absolutely nothing horrifying about this dividing up a saint's remains so they could radiate divine grace in multiple different locations was considered perfectly normal. Finally, the remains are fully reassembled in Gniezno. Boleslav buries Wojciech inside the cathedral with the absolute highest royal honors and orders the construction of a magnificent, towering tomb over him. Why did this hyper-pragmatic prince, a man who obsessively counted every single coin needed to maintain his heavy cavalry, just hand over an absolute fortune for a dead man? Because he understood the unwritten laws of his time far better than anyone else alive. In the 10th century, the bones of a saint were infinitely more valuable than any gold mine. Relics healed deadly diseases, they protected cities from the plague, and they drew tens of thousands of pilgrims who left mountains of money inside the city walls. European cities would literally go to open war with each other just to acquire holy relics, and monasteries actively hired professional thieves to practice so common it even received an official Latin term: furta sacra, sacred theft. For your church to become truly independent, for your archbishop to answer to absolutely no one but Rome rather than a neighboring foreign state, you desperately need your own local patron saint. Without one, your grand cathedral is nothing more than a very large wooden building. Boleslav wasn't just praying for his dear friend's soul. He was actively purchasing a geopolitical sovereignty generator. The transaction is complete. The massive investment now rests safely beneath the stone slabs of the altar in Gniezno. But for now, these are merely the remains of an unlucky, exiled Prague bishop. For this incredibly expensive asset to actually start working on the geopolitical arena, Europe doesn't just need a dead missionary. It needs an officially recognized Roman saint. And Boleslav initiates a bureaucratic process whose sheer speed is about to utterly shock the entire Christian world. In the 10th century, turning a man into a saint is an incredibly complex legal undertaking. Papal bureaucracy demands hard proof. You need a highly specialized commission. You need heavily documented eyewitness testimonies of literal miracles. Who was physically healed? Who regained their sight? Who stood up and walked after praying at the tomb? But most importantly, you need immensely powerful lobbyists embedded in Rome who will forcefully push your petition through the endless administrative channels. Boleslav, a warlord from the Slavic periphery, possessed absolutely no such connections in Rome. However, the deceased man himself certainly did. We remember exactly who Wojciech was prior to his exile. He was not just the Bishop of Prague. He was the close, personal friend of the young Holy Roman Emperor Otto III. When the grim news of Wojciech's horrific death on the Baltic shore finally reached the imperial court, the reaction was truly instantaneous. Otto was absolutely devastated. His beloved mentor and friend, the man with whom he had so recently strolled through the sunny Roman gardens, had accepted the crown of martyrdom. The emperor involves himself in the matter personally. He leverages his entire massive political weight to rapidly accelerate the canonization procedure. He is fully supported by Pope Sylvester II, known in the secular world as the brilliant French scholar Gerbert of Aurillac, who also happened to know the deceased man perfectly well. The ultimate result wildly exceeds even Boleslav's wildest expectations. By the year 999, a mere 2 years after he was struck down by Prussian spears, Wojciech is officially declared Saint Adalbert. 2 years. For the sluggish, grinding church machine of the Middle Ages, this is an unbelievable, practically lightning-fast speed. For Boleslav, this single piece of parchment from Rome fundamentally rewrites the rules of the game. Literally, in the span of a couple of months, his capital completely ceases to be just the wooden military headquarters of a successful tribal warlord. Gniezno is officially elevated to the status of a holy sanctuary fully sanctioned by Rome. Pilgrims begin flocking here in massive droves, and where there are pilgrims, there is hard security. Attacking a city where the physical remains of an officially recognized holy martyr rest is no longer just a localized, run-of-the-mill border conflict. It is a profound act of sacrilege, for which the invading monarch runs the very real risk of excommunication from the church and a massive, bloody rebellion by his own vassals. The plan worked absolutely flawlessly. The massive investment in silver handed over to the Prussians for a dismembered corpse has paid off entirely. Boleslav has successfully forged a divine spiritual shield for his young state, a shield that not a single neighboring army could ever hope to pierce. But the holy relics actually worked even better than the prince could have possibly calculated. Rumors of miraculous healings occurring at the tomb of Saint Adalbert ripple out across the entirety of Europe. They eventually reach the ears of the young Emperor Otto, and the passionate idealist sitting on the throne makes a monumental decision that completely shocks his own closest advisors and the German bishops. The ruler of the Holy Roman Empire publicly announces that he is leaving Italy. He gathers his entire court, his massive armed guard, and sets off for the east, straight into lands that the Romans still consider to be a wild, untamed wilderness. he is marching to Poland. Before we set off together with Emperor Otto into the snow-covered lands of Poland, we need to take a step back. We need to step away from grand geopolitics for a moment and examine the actual raw mechanics of this world. Today, we look at ornate church reliquaries and we see nothing more than old bones hidden safely behind a pane of glass. For a person living in the 10th century, the bones of a saint represent the literal, physical presence of divine, heavenly power on earth. It is a direct, unfiltered, open line of communication straight to God. A city where a formerly recognized holy relic appeared, whether it was the shattered skull of a martyr, a single finger bone of an apostle, or a tiny splinter from the true cross, instantly transformed into a massive economic powerhouse. An endless, unstoppable flood of desperate pilgrims would begin. These thousands of traveling people desperately needed inns, hot food, and beeswax candles. They aggressively bought up lead amulets bearing the saints' insignia in the bustling markets, and they left incredibly generous financial donations right at the altar. In that dense, sweating crowd, heavily fueled by frantic prayers and hypnotic chanting, the effect of mass hypnosis inevitably triggered. The blind suddenly regained their sight. The crippled joyfully threw away their crutches. Wild stories of these impossible miracles rapidly echoed down every single dirt road in Europe, constantly pulling in even larger crowds. One truly successful holy relic could comfortably feed an entire city for centuries on end. This is exactly why holy relics were worth vastly more than gold. And this is exactly why they were constantly, relentlessly stolen. In the Middle Ages, there existed an entire, highly organized shadow industry that eventually earned the official Latin term furta sacra, sacred theft. Major cities and wealthy monasteries would literally declare open war on one another just to violently seize someone else's holy patrons. Abbots of powerful monasteries actively hired highly skilled professional thieves to break into rival altars in the dead of night. But the most truly astonishing aspect of this entire practice is how the Church itself viewed it. The outright theft of holy relics was almost never severely condemned. The medieval logic applied here was utterly ironclad. A saint possesses his own divine free will. If he actively allowed himself to be stolen, if he did not strike the thief down with lightning right on the spot, it simply meant he was personally dissatisfied with his old location and actively wanted to move. The sheer act of the theft completely legalized itself. The physical remains were hidden away inside magnificent, breathtaking reliquaries. Master jewelers forged dazzling golden caskets for them, heavily encrusted with gleaming sapphires and pearls. These chests closely resembled miniature fortresses because they were, in fact, actual fortresses, fiercely guarding the absolute most critical economic and spiritual asset of the entire region. Once we fully grasp this highly specific context, we look at exactly what Boleslav accomplished in a completely different light. His gruesome transaction with the Prussians on the sandy Baltic shore was not merely an act of pious Christian mercy or tender care for the mutilated body of a fallen friend. It was an act of sheer, absolute financial genius. entirely bypassing the grueling centuries-long competition, completely avoiding the deeply humiliating process of stealing from foreign cathedrals. The warlord of the periphery had just acquired a top-tier, premium-grade relic. Absolutely clean, perfectly fresh bones of a martyr, fully recognized by the Pope in Rome. Boleslav literally purchased a massive generator of gross domestic product and absolute political sovereignty for his entire country. And this magnificent generator fired up so incredibly fast and with such overwhelming power that it magnetically pulled in the single most powerful man in all of Europe. That very same young boy emperor who had already given the strict order to saddle the horses down in Italy. The very end of the 10th century, Europe is living in a state of suffocating anticipation of the end of the world. The close of the calendar creeps toward the year 1000 after the birth of Christ, the more intense the absolute panic becomes. Doomsday preachers, standing in the city squares, loudly quote the book of Revelation. Terrified people are frantically signing over their entire earthly estates to the monasteries and waiting in terror for the deafening sound of the angels' trumpets. In this highly nervous, intensely anxious world, the absolute most powerful state in the West, the Holy Roman Empire, is being ruled by a young boy. By the year 1000, Otto III is only turning 20 years old. Two completely, vastly different, contrasting traditions violently collide within him. On his father's side, he is purely Germanic, a Saxon, the direct heir to a long line of harsh, brutal warrior kings. But on his mother's side, he is a Byzantine, the son of the highly refined Princess Theophanu. Otto fluently reads both Greek and Latin, actively surrounds himself with brilliant philosophers, and from a very young age fully absorbs the grand concept of a universal, harmonious world order. He has zero desire to be just another tribal warlord, spending his entire life bleeding over muddy border fortresses. He desperately wants to be a Roman emperor of a completely new, elevated type. His grand political program is formally called Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, the complete renewal of the Roman Empire. But Otto is not planning a massive military expansion. He envisions Europe as a grand, peaceful Christian confederation, a harmonious union of four perfectly equal parts. Illuminated Gospels from that era have actually survived, featuring incredibly detailed miniatures where these exact four parts are beautifully depicted as four submissive sisters carrying precious gifts directly to the emperor. Roma, Italy, Gallia, France, Germania, and the fourth sister, Slovenia, the Slavic world. To the ears of the old, entrenched German nobility, this grand concept sounded like pure, unadulterated political heresy. To officially equate the glorious Germans with the savage pagan periphery, a place they had been conditioned to view strictly as a prime source of tribute and shackled slaves, it was absolutely unthinkable. The powerful archbishops and hardened margraves loudly protested, but Otto believed with absolute fervor in his grand idea. In order for Slovenia to become a fully realized, sturdy pillar of the empire, he desperately needed a highly capable, fiercely loyal, and undeniably legitimate leader sitting in the east. It is at this exact, highly critical moment that the shocking news from the shores of the Baltic arrives in Aachen. Wojciech has been violently murdered, and his mutilated body has been purchased for an exorbitant sum by Prince Boleslav, who has laid it to rest right under the altar of his grand cathedral. We already know the truth. To a cold pragmatist, this is nothing more than a highly successful, calculated move on the grand geopolitical chessboard. But Otto views the world through entirely different eyes. To the intense mystic sitting on the imperial throne, this is a direct, undeniable sign from God himself. The absolute best friend of his youth has tragically accepted the bloody crown of martyrdom, and his holy bones have magically ended up squarely in the hands of Boleslav. This clearly means that the Polish prince is indeed the divine guardian of the sacred shrine and the truly chosen ruler of Sclavinia. The emperor makes a shocking decision that instantly sparks a low, deafening grumble of discontent across his entire court. He officially announces a holy pilgrimage, personally leading a truly massive entourage and a heavily armed escort. He is going to march to the east, straight into lands that the Romans consider to be absolutely wild. He is marching into Poland. The bitter winter of the year 1000. The dirt roads of Europe are entirely buried under heavy snowdrifts. The colossal imperial motorcade finally steps beyond the borders of comfortable, heavily settled Germany and plunges deep into the dark Slavic forests. The sheer logistics of managing a march of this magnitude in the dead of winter is a grueling test, pushing the absolute limits of human endurance, requiring thousands of wooden wagons and countless tons of forage. Otto had fully prepared himself to witness a harsh, desperately impoverished land. A quiet, desolate place, perfect for silent penance and deep prayers right at his friend's grave. But Boleslav had entirely different plans for this highly anticipated meeting. The Prince of the Periphery had meticulously prepared a grand theatrical spectacle for the Emperor, a show that was about to strike the entire Western elite completely dumb. Winter of the year 1000. The roads of Europe are heavily choked with snow. The movement of an imperial court in the 10th century is not some casual diplomatic road trip by a dozen horsemen. It is the literal migration of an entire breathing city. Marching alongside the 20-year-old Otto to the east are hundreds upon hundreds of heavily armored German knights, high-ranking bishops, the entire personal chancery, legions of servants, royal cooks and grooms. That is, thousands of hungry men and war horses that absolutely demand huge amounts of food and warmth every single day. Marching into an expedition like this in the absolute dead of winter is a pure logistical nightmare. Heavy supply wagons sink deep into the snowdrifts. Finding forage in frozen February villages is almost impossible, and local barons groan loudly under the crippling obligation to feed this passing horde. The German nobility frankly cannot understand why the emperor is risking his own health and utterly draining the imperial treasury just to bow before the frozen grave of a Bohemian exile located in the lands of some Slavic upstart. But Otto has zero interest in their endless grumbling. He is driven entirely by a grand idea. He crosses the Alps, pushes through Bavaria and Saxony, stubbornly marching straight toward the borders of the Polish lands. At a small place called Ilava, right on the absolute very edge of his domain, Boleslav officially greets his royal guests, and here, the very first massive disconnect with the Germans' expectations aggressively occurs. They are highly accustomed to viewing these territories as a savage, wild forest where the locals barely have enough grain to survive until the spring thaw. But Boleslav doesn't just offer the emperor a polite greeting. He actively takes over the complete logistical provisioning of this entire massive army. From the exact moment they cross the border, all the way to Gniezno, stretching across hundreds of miles, Otto's vast entourage experiences absolutely no shortage of fresh meat, baked bread, or dry hay for their horses. Boleslav flawlessly demonstrates perfect, seamless logistics. He effectively proves that his country is not some loose, unstable tribal confederation, but a highly functional state, possessing a massively efficient taxation and warehousing system. But the emperor himself cares very little about raw economics in that deeply spiritual moment. He is finally approaching the ultimate goal of his holy pilgrimage. The chronicler Thietmar of Mersburg left us a truly astonishing detail about the absolute final stretch of this brutal journey. When they were merely a few miles away from Gniezno, and the towering silhouette of the grand wooden cathedral finally appeared in the distance, Otto loudly ordered the entire massive procession to halt. He dismounted from his horse. He took off his footwear, and he began to walk straight through the freezing March snow, completely barefoot. The undisputed ruler of half of Europe, a man whose mere command was eagerly awaited by kings, was actively walking through the freezing mud and melting slush with completely bare, bloodied feet. Thietmar writes that Otto was openly weeping. For him, this was absolutely not a calculated political gesture. This was pure, unadulterated, deeply personal grief. He was walking forward to beg for God's divine forgiveness and to properly say goodbye to the dear friend he had tragically failed to protect. The barefoot emperor fully expected to find harsh, brutal asceticism at the end of his journey. He had mentally braced himself to step inside a deeply impoverished barbarian fortress, to drop to his bruised knees inside a dark, freezing church, and to spend his days in silent, unbroken prayer, exactly as befits a true, humble pilgrim at the very edge of the known world. But Boleslav had completely different plans for those days. He was expecting the emperor as a guest, and he had prepared to show him a true empire. March of the year 1000. Otto, with bare, bleeding feet, finally enters Gniezno. He is fully preparing himself for strict, harsh asceticism and quiet prayer at the tomb. But behind the thick wooden walls of the Slavic fortress, it is not silence that awaits him. He is met with a grand spectacle that the chronicler Gallus Anonymous would later describe as an absolute miracle. The snow hasn't even melted yet, but the royal courtyard is staged exactly as if it were a grand imperial residence located in the warm south. Boleslav has marched out his entire elite military retinue. Lining the path are massive, heavily armored knights with thick, gleaming gold chains resting upon their necks. For Otto and his colossal entourage, entirely massive tents have been erected, constructed completely out of pure silk. In the 10th century, on the banks of the Vistula River, silk is an incredibly rare material imported across half the known world. The fabric itself is worth vastly more than the very houses next to which these tents are pitched. A massive banquet begins. It lasts for 3 entire days. If you look at this event straight through the eyes of a hardened German margrave or a haughty bishop from Otto's entourage, the sheer reality of what is happening completely shatters their entire worldview. You marched all the way out here carrying a hard, deeply ingrained prejudice. The East is a wild, uncivilized wasteland. The locals are nothing more than scattered, primitive tribes who pay their tribute in raw animal pelts. You fully expected to be served coarse, crude food on rough wooden tables. Instead, they bring you roasted meat piled high on solid gold and silver platters. Extremely expensive wine flows endlessly from jewel-encrusted goblets. But the absolute main event occurs the second the dinner actually ends. Boleslav's servants do not take the dishes away to be washed. They gather up the solid gold plates, the heavy silver bowls, and the ornate drinking horns, and they simply hand them directly to the guests, to every single one of them. And they do this 3 days in a row. Following every single feast, the German nobility hauls literal kilograms of precious metals straight back to their silken tents. As Gallus Anonymous vividly notes, the prince explicitly ordered his men not to leave the royal guests with even a single possible reason for dissatisfaction. This is not the grand, generous Slavic soul on display. This is pure, unadulterated diplomacy. Boleslav was viciously striking right at the absolute most vulnerable point of the Germanic elite, their deeply ingrained condescension. By handing out gold with such staggering ease, he was loudly demonstrating his massive economic base. He was declaring, without uttering a single word, "I do not need your imperial patronage. I am significantly richer than most of you." The Piast state is not some subservient vassal territory, but a massive machine fully capable of paying for its own seat at the table. The German lords, who just yesterday on the snow-buried road were loudly whispering about the sheer madness of the young emperor, were now completely silent, heavily weighing massive golden goblets in their hands. The sheer weight of the gold forced them to shut their mouths. Otto, too, stared at his royal host in sheer amazement. He had marched all this way to bow before the dry bones of an exiled Prague bishop, but instead he had found a grand monarch operating with the sheer scale and flair of the Byzantine court. The 3-day feast had done its exact job perfectly. The guests are full. The loud skeptics have been thoroughly bought off, and Boleslav's immense authority is universally recognized. The feast was merely a highly expensive stage decoration for the real, hard negotiations. Now, while the German elite was sitting quietly with their hands completely full of silver, it was finally time to exchange gifts of a completely different, vastly higher order. 3 days of extravagant feasting are officially behind them. The loud noise in Gniezno finally dies down. High politics actively shifts away from the silver-laden tables and moves directly into the dim half-light of the cathedral, right next to Adalbert's holy tomb. Exactly what happens in that room is heavily documented in the historical chronicles. Otto III, the absolute master of the West, turns directly to Boleslav. He does not use words like vassal, tributary, or servant. He pronounces a completely different, shocking formula. Frater et cooperator imperii, brother and cooperator of the empire. To the highly sensitive ear of an 11th century German bishop, this sounds like a massive geopolitical earthquake. The reigning emperor of the Holy Roman Empire is publicly, formally recognizing a Slavic prince as his absolute equal. In Otto's grand design, Boleslav is meant to become the supreme ruler of Sclavenia, the fourth massive pillar of the completely renewed Christian world, standing on the exact same level as Rome, Gallia, and Germania. Then, Otto physically removes the imperial diadem right from his own head and formally places it directly onto Boleslav's head. Historians are still fiercely debating to this day whether this was an actual, legal royal coronation or simply a highly symbolic gesture of immense elevation. But for Boleslav, the exact legal nuances are not particularly important in this exact moment. The sheer, undeniable fact is what matters. The crown was placed on him by none other than the formal head of the entire Christian West. But in the year 1000, treaties were not sealed merely with spoken words and chunks of gold. The absolute highest seals were always stamped directly in heaven. A grand exchange of holy relics begins, the absolute ultimate act of high medieval diplomacy. Otto hands Boleslav a perfect copy of the Holy Lance of Saint Maurice. The original artifact is the absolute most important holy relic of the Holy Roman Empire, the ultimate symbol of its army's total invincibility. But a copy in those days did not mean a cheap fake. Forged directly into the iron blade of the spear handed to Boleslav was a tiny, authentic fragment of the actual nail used to crucify Christ. Under the strict logic of medieval theology, even a microscopic fraction of a holy relic transferred its absolute full divine power to the entire physical object. Boleslav was receiving hard, material proof in his hands that God himself was now firmly on his side. A holy spear that actively provided divine sanction for his absolute rule. What exactly does the prince give in return? Otto receives the actual severed arm of Saint Adalbert, that very same arm that had baptized people, and the arm of the beloved friend whom the emperor had tragically failed to save. This is an incredibly personal, deeply emotional gift for Otto, and an absolutely flawlessly calculated political maneuver for Boleslav. He is handing the emperor a literal piece of his own past, forever binding Gniezno to Rome and Aachen with an invisible, unbreakable thread. Symbolic gestures, golden diadems, and holy spears containing nails from the cross of the Lordall, of this looks truly magnificent. Boleslav had secured a level of international recognition that his father Mieszko could not have ever even dreamed of. But the Piasts harbored absolutely no naive illusions. Boleslav had studied the Germanic elite far too well, dating all the way back to his time as a young hostage in Quedlinburg. He understood perfectly. Otto may loudly call him his brother, but emperors are merely mortal, and their royal successors very easily forget past oaths. Symbols can rapidly tarnish. A diadem can be declared illegal. A holy spear can simply rust away. The prince needed significantly more than just a beautiful, glittering ceremony. He needed a solid, concrete foundation that could never be dismantled by a simple royal decree from the very next monarch. And right there, at that very same summit, he extracts a monumental decision from Otto, a decision that permanently redraws the entire administrative map of Europe. The Congress of Gniezno was not solely a grand festival of lavish generosity and powerful symbols. The absolute most important political act, the exact reason Boleslav had expended so much silver and sheer effort, occurred during those very same March days in the year 1000. Otto III officially signed the foundational document establishing the fully independent Archbishopric of Gniezno. Today, this specific fact might seem like nothing more than a simple reshuffling of clerical bureaucratic chairs. But for 10th century Europe, this meant a massive, fundamental shift in state sovereignty. The underlying issue was that up until that exact moment, every single church, priest, and believer located in Polish lands formally answered directly to the Archbishopric of Magdeburg over in Germany. And Magdeburg was not merely a quiet religious center. It was a massive, blunt instrument of imperial control. It was precisely through these foreign archbishops that ecclesiastical taxes were heavily collected, imperially loyal bishops were forcefully appointed, and the overall political strategy toward their eastern neighbors was crafted. In essence, the ultimate spiritual authority was firmly resting in the hands of a foreign, hostile state. The formal establishment of the Archbishopric of Gniezno completely severed this suffocating umbilical cord. From this moment forward, the Polish Church answered exclusively and directly to the Pope in Rome. It collected its own taxes. It independently managed its own diocese. Boleslav gained the ultimate right to independently influence the appointment of bishops in Krakow, Wrocław, and Kołobrzeg. This was true administrative and financial independence, cemented with the highest possible seal. To ensure this massive transition went incredibly smoothly, the absolutely correct man was needed for the incredibly powerful post of the first archbishop. That man was Radim Gaudentius, that very same half-brother of Saint Wojciech Adalbert, the man who had miraculously survived the brutal Prussian massacre and brought Boleslav the news of the bishop's violent death. To Rome and the emperor, this candidate was absolutely flawless. Who better to smoothly run a newly minted church built directly on the bones of a holy martyr than his own half-brother? For Boleslav, Radim was incredibly convenient as well. The man owed his very life and his high status completely and personally to the prince. When the shocking news of the sweeping decisions made at the Congress of Gniezno finally reached Germany, an absolutely massive scandal erupted among the imperial nobility and the senior clergy. The bishops of Magdeburg were completely livid. They had just been stripped of a massive, highly lucrative territory, immense revenues, and critical levers of political influence. They openly, loudly accused the young emperor of actively betraying the vital interests of the German nation solely to satisfy his delusional fantasies of a universal peace. Thietmar of Merseburg, perfectly voicing the outrage of the deeply conservative elite, would later bitterly write, "May God forgive the emperor for making a tributary into a lord." The fierce German margraves viewed Boleslav as an incredibly dangerous barbarian who needed to be kept tightly on a very short leash. Yet Otto, with his very own hands, had literally just handed him a diadem, a holy spear, and his very own, completely German independent church. Boleslav's triumph was absolute and unquestionable. His long-term, meticulously calculated strategy, which had kicked off with the highly pragmatic purchase of a friend's dismembered corpse, had worked absolutely flawlessly. He had acquired everything he ever wanted: a powerful standing army, his own personal patron saint, massive international recognition, and complete administrative independence. It truly seemed that Otto's grand visionary project for the peaceful integration of Sclavinia into the fully renewed empire had been successfully launched. Two powerful rulers, bound by a holy oath at the altar and a shared deep reverence for a martyr, could easily alter the entire trajectory of Eastern European history. The grand plan looked absolutely flawless. But history, as a rule, is notoriously unforgiving of flawless plans, and the very first crushing blow was struck neither from the west nor from the east, but straight from the very beating heart of the empire itself. Immediately following the Congress of Gniezno, Otto III heads back south. He is absolutely certain that the grand architecture of his new world is already fully built. There is now a highly reliable pillar of support in the east. The Polish Church is completely independent, and the grand idea of a renewed Roman Empire is finally taking on flesh. All that remains is to firmly cement this new world order from the exact center of the continent, from Rome itself. But the Romans had entirely different ideas on this matter. The Eternal City was absolutely, completely uninterested in the young emperor's grand visions of universal harmony. The fierce local aristocracy was vastly more concerned with securing tight control over the Pope and the lucrative city taxes. In the year 1001, a massive armed rebellion erupts in Rome. Otto, the very man who had so recently placed a grand diadem on Bolesław's head and confidently decided the fate of Europe, suddenly finds himself completely besieged. He is forced to frantically flee the capital and hide inside the heavily fortified castle of Paterno, desperately waiting for heavy cavalry reinforcements to arrive from Germany. The heavy reinforcements failed to arrive in time. In January of 1002, Otto III dies. He was only 22 years old. The court physicians would officially blame his sudden death on malaria, a disease that frequently decimated northerners trapped in the sweltering Italian swamps. His bitter enemies would quietly whisper about deadly poison. Regardless, the final result was the exact same. The visionary monarch who had desperately dreamed of uniting the entire Christian world without a single war had died miserably in exile, locked securely inside a stone fortress. His sudden death instantly turned into a massive, grueling logistical nightmare for his stranded entourage. The knights had to actively conceal the sheer fact of the emperor's death from the violent rebels. Fighting their way secretly straight through fiercely rebelling Italian cities, they carried his lifeless body north to Aachen to bury him right next to Charlemagne. A sharp, unbelievably cruel contrast to that highly solemn, triumphant pilgrimage through the snow-covered forests of Poland just a couple of short years prior. When the exhausted messengers finally delivered this grim news to Gniezno, Boleslav very quickly grasped one exceptionally dark truth. His entire, meticulously constructed grand diplomacy, his highly elevated status as a brother of the empire, the complete sovereignty of his new archbishopric, every single bit of it hinged exclusively on the given word of a single 22-year-old boy. And now that word was completely worthless. A vicious struggle for total power erupts in Germany, from which a brand new king ultimately emerges victorious: Henry II. If Otto constantly thought in grand categories of universal brotherhood, Henry is a harsh, remarkably dry pragmatist, and he heavily relies on that exact same conservative German elite that had fiercely ground their teeth in pure anger at the lavish feast in Gniezno. To Henry, Boleslav is absolutely not a trusted cooperator. To him, he is nothing more than a highly dangerous neighbor sitting on the eastern border, a savage usurper who, due to the sheer stupidity of the previous ruler, had somehow acquired far too much sovereignty. This egregious mistake absolutely needed to be brutally corrected. Messengers from Italy galloped furiously to Germany via long, highly circuitous routes, desperately hiding from the violent rebels. While they were transporting the embalmed body of 22-year-old Otto up north, Europe was rapidly, violently shifting. The shocking news of the emperor's sudden death finally reached Gniezno in the very first months of the year 1002. We do not know exactly how Boleslav reacted. The medieval chroniclers rarely record human emotions, but the new geopolitical alignment was glaringly obvious to anyone who knew how to read a map. The era of grand diplomacy was entirely over. The complete architecture of the New World, every single solemn agreement made at the Congress of Gniezno, the highly exalted status of brother of the empire, all of it had rested completely on a single human being. And now that person was gone. The highly traditional, bloody struggle for the completely empty throne kicked off in Germany. The ultimate victor emerging from the chaos was the Duke of Bavaria, a man who would enter history as Henry II. Henry was the absolute, complete polar opposite of his young predecessor. No more boyish daydreams about universal, harmonious brotherhood. No more foolish illusions about the absolute equality of nations. He was a harsh, completely dry pragmatist. He relied heavily on that exact same German aristocracy that 2 years prior had clenched their jaws in sheer humiliation at the feast in Gniezno. To Henry, the Polish prince was absolutely not an ally, but merely an upstart who had grown far too rich. An Eastern problem that required an immediate, harsh solution, forcing the Piasts directly back into their proper status as submissive, obedient tributaries. Boleslav understood the situation flawlessly. The exact second Henry firmly established himself on the throne and gathered his massive army, he was going to march east. Passively waiting around for imperial envoys to arrive with new, deeply humiliating demands was entirely pointless. And so the prince makes his monumental decision. He does not sit around waiting for the blow, he strikes first. While the German barons were busy dividing up high-ranking posts in Aachen and loudly celebrating the grand coronation of their new ruler, the heavy cavalry of the Piasts was rapidly mobilized. The massive standing army that Boleslav had funded for years by selling Baltic amber and shackled slaves aggressively crossed the western border. The primary target of the devastating strike was not the deep interior of Germany, but the Margraviest, the highly militarized buffer zones of the empire. In a matter of mere weeks, Polish regiments completely overrun Lusatia, the lands of the Milceni and Meissen. This was absolutely not a mere raid for quick plunder. This was cold, calculated geopolitics. Boleslav was simply forcefully pushing the border of his state as far west as humanly possible. He actively created his very own buffer zone so that the inevitably looming war would be fought entirely on foreign soil. Piast troops seized massive stone fortresses, entirely choking off the exact roads through which the German army would have eventually struck at Poznan. The Emperor of the North was no longer the faithful cooperator of Rome. By seizing Meissen, Boleslav had thrown down a direct, bloody challenge to the entire German military machine. The brief, glittering era of heavy golden goblets, massive silken tents, and highly elevated philosophical discussions about God had ended just as rapidly as it had begun. Lying straight ahead was a brutally long, utterly exhausting 15-year war. A savage war of attrition that would completely burn through the massive resources of both states, reduce the sprawling borderlands to ash, and violently test the absolute structural integrity of the grand foundation Boleslav had laid down in the year 1000. Heavy, steel-gray clouds were rapidly closing in over the skies of Europe. We began this historical story with a dismembered, mutilated body lying on a sandy Baltic shore. Boleslav paid the exact weight of the exiled Prague bishop's bones in pure silver just to buy his entire country a highly coveted seat in the Premier League of European politics. And for one fleeting moment, it actually worked. The Congress of Gniezno became the absolute peak, a moment where a Slavic ruler stood shoulder to shoulder as a perfect equal with the ultimate master of the West. But precisely herein lies the ultimate grand paradox of this entire story. Boleslav placed his absolute biggest bet on a naive idealist. He invested everything he had into a fragile system that was held together exclusively by the grand vision of a single human being. The exact second Otto closed his eyes for the final time in that Italian castle, the beautiful illusion of a universal Christian brotherhood instantly shattered into dust. In order to firmly protect exactly what he had gained through soft diplomacy and holy relics, Boleslav was forced to draw his sword. The grand sovereignty that had been freely gifted to him by a young dreamer now had to be violently torn from the teeth of harsh pragmatists. There are no obvious mustache-twirling villains in this story. Henry II was not a bloodthirsty tyrant that was desperately trying to pull a fracturing empire back together and secure its borders exactly as the brutal era demanded. Otto III was not a raving lunatic. He attempted to piece Europe together ahead of schedule, long before it was ever truly ready for it. and Bolesław's long path brilliantly demonstrates the icy, brutal mechanics of absolute power. Divine legitimacy, signed treaties, official recognition from world leaders, all of these things are absolutely necessary. But not a single parchment with a wax seal, not a single golden spear containing a microscopic sliver of a holy nail carries any actual weight if there are not real, iron-tipped spears standing directly behind them. High status is never granted forever. It must be violently, constantly reaffirmed. Boleslav understood that the world had shifted vastly faster than the black ink had even dried on Otto's tomb, and he fully accepted the brand new rules of the game without a single moment of hesitation. The grand cathedral in Gniezno, just a couple of short years after the Great Congress. The highly solemn Latin hymns have completely faded away. The haughty German bishops and powerful margraves have long since departed, carrying off those massive golden platters and heavy silver goblets deep inside their saddlebags. The massive church is completely empty. It smells heavily of cold beeswax, burning incense, and damp wood. Safely resting beneath the massive stone slabs of the altar are the holy relics of Saint Adalbert, the dry bones of a man who had merely wanted to baptize pagans and quietly pray in absolute peace. They executed their earthly task absolutely flawlessly. They jump-started the massive flywheel of grand history, violently transforming a localized border conflict on the periphery of the continent into a massive, bloody clash of entire civilizations. Adalbert sleeps peacefully in the deep dark, while somewhere far off to the west, well beyond the Elbe and the Oder, heavy wooden supply wagons are already loudly creaking. Blacksmiths are relentlessly striking their anvils with heavy hammers day and night, drawing out fresh, razor-sharp steel blades. A long, viciously grinding era is rapidly approaching, one in which dead saints will no longer be able to stop marching armies. Lying straight ahead for Boleslav are 15 brutal years of continuous, exhausting war of attrition. Endless sieges, burning cities, incredibly fragile truces, highly controversial alliances with pagans against fellow Christians, and vicious stabs in the back. How the warlord of the periphery successfully withstood the full crushing onslaught of the entire Holy Roman military machine, and ultimately became the very first king of Poland, we will tell you all about that in the very next episode. History is always written by the victors, but the ones who actually survive it are those who know exactly how to strike first.